We have had so many people talk to us about the way that their medical team treated them when they didn't want to get an abortion. And if you, listeners, could be that person that just treats them with basic decency and recognizes that their child is valuable to them, you could change their entire lives. There's so much trauma related to the way that some medical practitioners handle adverse diagnosis, and uh, we could do a lot more to be pushing back on that.
Welcome to Caring for Both, a curbside consult series by the American Association of Pro-Life Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or AAPLOG. On this podcast, we bring on experts to provide insights to support you as a medical professional in your life-affirming practice and career. I'm your host for today, Dr. Christina Francis, board-certified OB-GYN and CEO of AAPLOG. And today I'm so happy to be back with Monica Snyder, one of our favorite guests on the podcast, Executive Director of Secular Pro-Life. Secular Pro-Life is a nonprofit organization committed to advancing secular arguments against abortion, creating a pro-life space for non-religious people, and building interfaith coalitions of people interested in advancing secular arguments. Monica, as I said, has become a regular guest on this podcast, and as usual, she's here today to give me a reverse interview, asking the burning questions that secular pro-life's followers, and I think many others, have for pro-life OB-GYNs like me. I'm excited for this one, which will be about what it's like for doctors to be openly pro-life in a pro-abortion medical culture. And even, I think, will be applicable for people outside of the field of medicine as well, who are kind of wondering the same thing. With the leadership of major medical professional organizations, board certifying bodies, and more, attempting to force a radical pro-abortion ideology onto everyday physicians, it certainly requires courage and persistence for pro-life doctors to practice in the way they know is best for their pregnant and preborn patients. So, Monica, I will let you take it from here.
Yes, thank you for having me again. Very happy to be with you. I wanted to talk about this subject today because, like you said, it does apply not just for medical professionals, but for a lot of people. Secular Pro-Life has a lot of people asking how to navigate being publicly pro-life. And I think it might have unique pressures in the medical community. So the first question I had for you is, do you have a sense of what proportion of AAPLOG's members, like dues-paying members, are publicly pro-life or publicly affiliated with AAPLOG compared to, I know you have dues paying members who aren't part of your directory, but some are. Do you have a sense of what the proportions are?
You know, I'm not sure what an exact percentage is because I think it varies widely based on where they're at.
Yeah.
And as anyone who's gone to our website and our public directory of pro-life physicians, again, these are dues paying members who are up to date on their dues, who agree to be listed publicly. So we are very protective of our physicians, of any of our members, understanding that some of them are in places where it's very difficult to be publicly pro-life, which I know for many of your followers, it probably is as well. So, we get calls all the time from, say, women in California who are saying, man, it looks like you hardly have any members in California, and I'm looking for a pro-life doctor near me. We actually have a lot of members in California, but of course there are definitely parts of California where it is going against the grain for sure to be publicly pro-life. And depending on their practice environment, I think for people that may work in academia, it's going to be much harder for them to be publicly pro-life because that's not the accepted narrative in academia, or for
That's
people
not the
who might
vibe.
be exactly, or for people who might be working in large hospital-owned practices, or places like Kaiser Permanente, where you have this large hospital network that is definitely doing abortions. And, it might be harder for them versus somebody who's maybe in their own practice where they own their own group with their partners, which is actually it's so rare now, actually, because it's really hard to practice medicine now in a doctor-owned group. So I think it really depends, but definitely what we see is more people in states that are considered to be pro-life states, maybe in the Midwest or in the South, are going to be much more likely to list themselves publicly out of just because they have less fear, I think, of facing professional blowback.
Sure. I am not I. Secular Pro-Life's Instagram account and some other accounts follow some of AAPLOG's public members
Mhm.
who are more likely to engage online and are more likely to have the courage and the, draw from their knowledge and experience to push back on certain narratives online. And I've seen situations where, for example, a maternal fetal medicine specialist will push back with the lightest touch. It could be just to say, what do you mean that doesn't really make sense? And get 87 comments saying, you shouldn't be a doctor, you hate women, blah, 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 blah. And it's online. Like, it's online. Take it
Sure.
for what it's worth. But to see that kind of backlash, if they even step one toe outside of pro abortion orthodoxy, I can only imagine what kind of pressure some of them are feeling. So you
Yeah.
sort of already answered my second question, which was why do many of your members choose to remain private about their affiliation with AppLog? I feel like if you have any more to say about that, feel free.
Yeah, well, I mean, certainly some of it I think is that fear of professional blowback. We have a member who lost her job, not because she listed herself publicly with Applog. She had been listed publicly with Applog for a long time, but she started to speak out more publicly. And after testifying in front of Congress, um, her group started to get sort of a lot of hate calls from pro abortion ideologues, and she ended up being essentially forced out of her group that she'd been in for over 2 decades because of taking that stance. And so that certainly is a fear, and I think a legitimate consideration for many of our members. Also, some members just I think aren't listed publicly because honestly, even though we remind them to do it, it's a step they have to take. They have to opt
Right.
in to being listed. So I think that's part of it. And I think maybe some are afraid of losing patients, but one of the things that we tell them often is it is the most visited part of our website. It will actually be a boom to your practice, especially if you're practicing in a place where there isn't a plethora of pro-life physicians. If we had somebody who was listed publicly in Washington State or Oregon or Colorado or California or New York,
It's like a
they
lightning rod.
I know they'd get a ton of patients. So certainly I'm not telling anyone what they have to do. Everybody knows their own situation best. But we do know that women are desperately seeking pro-life physicians who they know are going to fight for them and their babies. And
Yes.
and so I think it's important for people to know that it is actually it may have some downsides depending on where you're at, but there is always going to be an upside to it, which is that patients are really seeking this kind of care.
I'm not surprised that that the doctors who are concerned about this might not realize the upside of it. We have an analog with secular pro-life followers. There are some parallels where you have people, what we call non-traditional pro-lifers, who are in these spaces where all of their social circles are very, very pro-choice. Nobody would expect
Mhm.
an atheist or a Democrat or whoever to be pro-life. And sometimes they'll come to us and say, I'm kind of sick of holding on to this secret, but I'm
Sure.
nervous that if I go public with this, these various bad things will happen. And I have a similar talk with them that you do, where it's like, yeah, they might. The things you're worried about happening might happen. But the flip side is we know statistically that you are not the only pro-life Democrat or pro-life atheist or pro-life whatever. And when you shoot up that flare gun, yes, a bunch of the people you don't want to hear from are going to yell at you, but it's also shooting up that flare gun to the other quiet, private people in your sphere who think they're the only ones. And how are we ever going to find each other if some of us don't stand up and say, this is how I feel? And especially important with doctors, because
Yeah.
I feel like the moderate pro-choice person makes the mistake of thinking that if you are a pro-choice doctor, then women will all be comfortable with you because you support them if they want the pregnancy, you support them if they don't. And there's situations like that, but they don't understand how often medical professionals run the gamut from glib to aggressive about when you should get an abortion when you don't necessarily want to. So I just want to reiterate to anyone listening to this, especially medical professionals, there are a lot of women and families and parents out there who want to have medical professionals who view their prenatal children the same way they do, as valuable children who they want to protect. Okay, I'll get off that soapbox. What would you say to a doctor who is trying to decide if they want to publicly list with you versus not? What are the things they should think about before they make that decision?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think it's something, again, for someone outside of medicine who may be thinking about being more public, you need to think about the same thing. So obviously, you need to think about your particular practice environment. And, do you have another colleague who you know, or two who you know, are at least somewhat in agreement with you? And not that you would have to out them, but, if you do get some blowback, are they people who will likely come to your defense? So I think that's one thing to think about. Another thing to think about is, does your group or your hospital have any way within legal bounds that they then could force you out of the group because you said that? So we actually have strong conscience protections in this country. And thankfully now, wherever somebody might stand on how they feel about the current administration, one definite benefit about this current administration is we have people who are dedicated to defending our conscience rights now in HHS, which we did not under Javier Becerra. So we have good protections in place. And so, if you are in a group and you've always done, the best job that you possibly can, you have good relationships within your group, things like that, you should know you have legal protections if someone were to try to force you out simply because you're pro-life. I think the other thing is that by listing publicly with us, it doesn't mean that you have to then be out, speaking publicly like I am in the media or even on your social media. Again, it just says, I believe in the inherent value of both of my patients, both mom and baby. I want to provide them with the best medicine. And I'm willing to say that that's how I practice. And I think more and more we're seeing doctors be um, unhappy with where groups like ACOG, the American College of OB-GYNs, have gone, which is just off the rails with regard to abortion. So, we know that 76 to 93% of OB-GYNs don't do abortions as part of their practice. That doesn't mean all of those people are pro-life, certainly. I mean, I
Sure.
think, a good percentage of them would probably consider themselves pro-choice to some extent. But I think many of them, consistent with where the American public is at, are not okay with abortions in the third trimester on babies who are viable, who are past that point of viability, things like that. And ACOG is all in on third trimester abortions for any reason, without regulation, without justification. And so, what I would say to someone who's considering, do I, list myself publicly with APLOG? It could even be if you are just not there, where ACOG is at, and you say, they're not representing me anymore. I want to be represented by an organization that actually represents the way I practice. Then you could list yourself publicly. So, and then I think the other thing is, I would just go back to what you just said before, Monica, which is that, we know that courage is contagious. And when one person stands up in their environment, and that may just be to say, look, I'm not really comfortable with where ACOG is at on this issue, because I believe in defending both of my patients. I believe that when a family gets an adverse prenatal diagnosis, the first thing that we offer them should not be, you can end the life of your child and get over it, which is what many people are offered. I think if one person stands up, even in just a very, what might be seen as a very reasonable way, not standing on the street corner with a bullhorn, things like that. Now, there's times that that needs to be done, and I'm all in for doing that personally, but I know many people aren't there, and that's okay. Just standing up and saying, as a profession, we focus on mom and baby. Why is there this move all of a sudden to forget about the baby completely, much less to recommend something to mom that we know is harmful for her? It's okay to stand up against that. And as you said, other people will see that and will be emboldened and will come alongside of you. So I think those are the things that are the most important. I personally would say to people, I know you're much more active on social media than I am. But I personally would say to people, what people say online, ultimately, personally, I think you just need to overlook it. If they're
Oh,
attacking things, I mean, you can
as
engage
someone
with
who
them
is
if you
very
want
online,
to,
I
but
couldn't agree more.
yeah,
Like,
yeah,
we say that they are paper tigers. People
yeah,
online, they'll say all kinds of things. Just remember, if you were sitting across from them at a coffee shop, 98% of them wouldn't have the nerve. They're clowns. You don't need to worry about it. And I also wanted to point out to anyone listening that we're talking about medical professionals deciding whether to publicly list with you and whether to say anything publicly about this. And I agree with everything you said. But anyone listening who isn't there yet, I want to encourage you that also in your private life, even just in your interpersonal life with your friends and family. You are a medical professional, you have relevant expertise and knowledge that most people don't have. And even if you're not ready to say publicly online or through AAPLOG or anything else, I hope in your interpersonal conversations you feel the courage to say, I'm a doctor, I've done this for a long time, and I don't agree with what you just said. And just leave it at that. You can elaborate if you want or not, but pro-life people have every bit as much of a right to speak to our experiences and our perspectives in all spheres as pro-choice people do. And I think sometimes we start to feel, not me, but some people start to feel that pro-choice is the default, and if they speak up, they have to justify their deviation from that orthodoxy. No, you don't. No, you
Right.
don't. You could just
Absolutely.
say, no, I don't agree, and I'm not
Absolutely.
gonna, and leave it at that. Especially doctors. Especially
Yeah.
doctors.
Yeah,
So
no, totally. I think that's such a great point, Monica, because, you know, whether somebody's a doctor or they're not, if they are just speaking the truth based on, evidence that they have based on good arguments, all of that, which is one of the things why I love us talking, because both of our organizations approach this not from a religious standpoint, but based on, data and evidence. And not that there's anything wrong with a religious argument in support of life, obviously, um, I think you come off as very reasonable when you bring up certain thing. Either just say I don't agree with that, and then if they ask why, then you can give them the reasons why, or just listing out, as a physician, I don't agree with that because I just don't think it's good for my patients.
yeah.
We have a strong argument to stand on, and it's much easier for people to be picked off when they're standing alone. But when they're not alone, when there's a group, even if it's a small group, you are much harder to pick off. And so,
Yep.
whether you're somebody who's not a medical professional, but you have a couple other friends in your sphere who would agree with you, or for doctors who are thinking about do they list publicly with us or not, one of the good reasons too is that we're nearly 8,000 strong now. So you won't be alone. You're with this group of thousands of other medical professionals.
You won't be alone, and you're helping other people not be alone. It's a
Yeah, absolutely.
cyclical thing. And so I also want to say, like, if you say, well, I just don't think that's a good argument based on my knowledge of this, that's important. But especially for medical professionals, feel very encouraged to say, I've witnessed this and this and this happen with my patients, and I'm not going to forget that that happened.
Yeah.
And that affects how I approach this situation.
Yeah.
You guys are speaking from kind of the battlefield, especially the ones that are actually in reproductive medicine, although it also applies in emergency medicine and in other fields. You see directly the things that I hear about. I have people through secular pro-life, parents, tell me about their experiences, tell me about the way that they weren't treated appropriately or their children weren't treated appropriately when they thought that they should have had more of a defense from their medical team. So I have that indirect witness. But you guys have the direct witness, and more people need to understand that this is a part of the argument. It's, yes, of course, in the abortion debate, debates about bodily rights, debates about fetal personhood, those are very, very important. But I also want moderate pro-choice people to understand that there's no utopia policy here. It is simply not enough, even if you are pro-choice, to say, let's just keep it legal and not worry about it. There's lots of ways this plays out that have harmful effects. And the doctors who are caring for these patients, your voice is so important to
Yeah.
say, I watched this happen. I've been seeing this in my ER. I've been seeing this in my office, and nobody should be okay with this.
Yeah.
That's so important. Again, to your listeners, even if you're just saying it in your interpersonal lives, stand up. All right. I think it's very important. You can do it in tiny steps. You do not have to get on X and get in a flame war.
That's
In
right.
fact, I strongly recommend against it. But there are other ways that you can use your voice, and you're speaking from a position of authority that really matters.
Yeah.
So I got a little off topic there. Is there anything else you can speak to about when a medical professional lists publicly with you? You talked about how that might mean they actually see an increase in patients, especially if they're in a pro-choice state. Are there any other effects it has for them on the positive end that people who choose to stay private might not get to experience?
Well, I think that there again, if somebody decides to list publicly, chances are they're going to be a little bit more involved with AppLog and with the work we're doing. Just, if they're choosing to list publicly, I think it follows that they will kind of stay a little bit more in tuned. And so certainly, the benefits of being a dues paying member of APLOG to our members is not only are we keeping them up to date on the latest evidence that exists about the impact of abortion on our patients. So again, that's something that they can use not only in discussions with their colleagues, but in discussions with their patients too. If we value truly informed consent for all of our patients, then we should want to know about the latest data. And they're certainly not going to hear that from ACOG.
Right.
The other thing is just, I think, the community that people experience. Our conference this year was just another reminder, as it typically is to me, of how encouraged people are when they come together with other medical professionals who value the lives of both of our patients. And people say, it just feels like such a breath of fresh air.
Yeah.
And again, I think we probably had people at the conference who they may not agree with me on every single point when it comes to abortion, but they agree that it's not good healthcare for our patients. And
Right.
that's why they're there. And the freedom to speak, I think they feel is so great. And so that's a benefit to them. The other thing is, again, when you're a part of an organization that's nearly 8,000 strong, we are pushing back against the threats that exist that I know keep many people silent. The threats from ACOG, the threats from our board certification entity, the American Board of OB-GYNs, we're pushing back on that. And so we want people to be a part of that. If they want to see things change, the only way to do that is to have their voice be heard. Now, they can do that on their own, if they're bold enough to do that, that's great. But if not, in joining us, then that allows us to say we are representing all of these physicians who don't agree with what you're doing, who are saying these threats are illegal. These threats are not conducive to us providing good care to our patients. So I would say all of those benefits can come along with being a part of APLOG. But again, I think listing yourself publicly is a very big step to helping patients know that you value the life of them and their child. I'll wrap up real quick with this. One significant benefit I could see is we hear from so many, and I know you do too, from so many families who have received adverse diagnoses for their babies during pregnancy, who
Yep.
say that they had to advocate so hard for themselves to get a doctor to do anything for them other than recommend an abortion.
Yep.
And so I think, by listing publicly, if a family is finding themselves in a really difficult situation like that, they can have this ray of hope by going to our directory and think, if I go see this doctor, then I know they're not going to try to force me into an abortion, and they're going to talk
Yep.
with me about all of my options. And so that would be just another benefit, that you'd get to have such an amazing impact in the lives of your patients in that
I
way.
can't underscore that enough. We have had so many people talk to us about the way that their medical team treated them when they didn't want to get an abortion. And if you, listeners, could be that person that just treats them with basic decency and recognizes that their child is valuable to them, you could change their entire lives. There's so much trauma related to the way that some medical practitioners
Yeah.
handle adverse diagnosis. And w- I- we could do a lot more to be pushing back on that in a positive way, just standing
Right.
up and saying, I'll help you. So,
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, Monica, I hope that this was an encouragement to, people that follow secular pro-life, as well as to medical professionals who follow us. We realize, obviously, Monica and I both realize the sort of slings and arrows that might come your way if you are publicly pro-life. But again, I think if we focus on what is it that we're for, we are
yeah.
for women and children receiving the best healthcare possible. And that's what we're advocating for. That's hard to argue against, actually. People will still argue against it, but it's much harder to argue against. And so I think the more we can do to support one another, our two organizations, but also the more we can encourage any medical professional out there that if you practice according to the ethic that all human lives are valuable and worthy of dignity, that you should be in some way vocal about that, because it is actually what patients are seeking. And so whether that be that you speak out on social media or you list publicly on our directory so patients can find you,
Or you
choose.
talk about it at dinner with your
Exactly.
family. Yeah.
Exactly. Exactly. choose to do something so that people will understand that as a physician, as a medical professional who knows the science of human development, that we recognize that these are vulnerable human beings who deserve our protection, and their moms deserve for us to provide them with the best possible healthcare as well. So, Monica, thank you so much. I'm so excited to do another one of these as
Yeah.
well. So thank you so much for coming on. We always love having you.
Same. Thanks for having me again.
And Monica, remind our listeners again, how can they find you and Secular Pro-Life and follow the amazing work that y'all are doing?
So we're on all the social media channels. Usually it's one word, Secular Pro-Life. I think on TikTok it's got underscores, but if you look for it, you'll find it. Our website is secularprolife.org. But if you want to keep especially close tabs with us, the most important thing is to get our email newsletter. That's where we're going to be telling you about events that we're doing or content that was particularly resonant. And you can get on there by going to secularprolife.org/contact. And then you can just sign up for it right there if you really want to know what's going on all the time. We send it out, I think, usually every Friday.
Amazing. And there, I can attest to the fact that their emails are just amazing. Their content that they produce is really, really good. They give you strong arguments to use in response to some of the attacks, I would say, from abortion advocates, or some of the arguments that abortion advocates use. And hopefully we can do another one of these where maybe where I ask you questions, but where we talk about your wisdom in talking to people who disagree with us about this issue, and where we can try and find common ground and go from there, because you guys are just so, so good at that. So I'd encourage anybody listening to go follow Secular Pro-Life, sign up for their emails. You will not regret it. So
Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. And thank you to our listeners for joining us today. If you like this episode, please be sure to give us a like and a subscribe on YouTube. Or if you, like me, listen to your podcast on a podcast app, give us a 5-star review. Also, if you are enjoying the work that we are doing to help clarify the confusion that's out there and bring truth to this discussion, please consider supporting us either by continuing to listen to us, or if you are open to it, by donating to help support the work that we are doing. We can only do this through our member dues and through the support of generous donors. You can do that by going to our website, AAPLOG.org, and we will link it in the show notes as well. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you on our next episode.